We, in consultation with our Portuguese colleagues, are absolutely committed to finding out what happened to Madeleine McCann. And we've been in a unique position over the last 2 years in drawing together three strands: Portuguese, UK and private investigators. And so on that basis, I still genuinely believe that there is a possibility that she's alive.
We, together with our Portuguese colleagues, are absolutely committed to finding out what happened to Madeleine McCann. That was the official declaration, spoken with conviction by the leading investigators in Britain. They insisted that for the past 2 years, they had been working through 3 channels: Portuguese police, UK authorities, and private investigators to piece together fragments of truth. And for that reason, they still believed there was a chance Madeleine was alive somewhere out there. But then came the haunting question: what happens when governments have more to lose than to find? Madeleine vanished in 2007. It should have been a desperate race to save a child. Instead, it quickly turned into an international chess game where each side seemed less interested in justice and more determined to protect its own image and interests. In Portugal, the initial response fumbled the crime scene and set the case adrift. Years later, Germany hesitated when prosecution loomed, and the UK locked away crucial records, refusing to share even with allies. So, instead of asking, "Who took Madeleine?" the world was left with a darker question: who made sure we would never truly know? Because this case has never been only about one missing child. It has become a living case study of how political pressure, media staging, and international diplomacy can bury truth deeper than any grave. Portugal was the stage where everything began, and it was also where the first irreversible mistakes were made. When police entered apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, they did not find a protected crime scene. What they found was chaos. Friends of the McCanns, resort staff, even curious onlookers had already walked in and out before investigators arrived. The air had shifted, objects had been touched, and the fragile threads of evidence had already begun to unravel. No forensic perimeter was set. No critical samples were taken immediately. The apartment had been compromised beyond repair. The very window through which an intruder was said to have entered showed no signs of forced entry and had been freshly cleaned, leaving only Kate McCann's fingerprints. Even the simplest investigative procedures, sketching the apartment, bagging everyday objects, dusting for latent prints, were delayed or ignored. These failures would go on to define Portugal's role in the case. By 2008, the investigation was closed due to lack of evidence. And though the Polícia Judiciária still technically held the core files, their authority was already slipping away. They remained the official custodians of the case, but the weight of their mistakes ensured that they were no longer its leaders. Step by step, Portugal's control diminished. While the crime had taken place on their soil, their voice in the search for justice grew quieter. The mishandling of those first crucial hours, the so-called golden window in missing child cases, ensured that their credibility was shattered, and with it, their ability to drive the case forward. While Portugal held the ground where Madeleine vanished, it was the United Kingdom that seized control of the story. The McCanns were not just grieving parents abroad. They were British citizens, politically shielded and backed by a government determined to protect its own. And from London came a series of decisions that reshaped the investigation. Not toward clarity, but toward control. Repeated requests from Portuguese investigators for access to the McCanns' phone records, banking information, even Madeleine's medical files were denied. These were not minor omissions. They were the kind of fundamental details that could have confirmed or destroyed entire theories. Without them, any reconstruction of events remained incomplete, almost blind. Yet no legal justification was ever given. The silence itself spoke volumes. Access to the McCanns' private data would not be allowed. Political interference reached the highest levels. Then Prime Minister Gordon Brown personally contacted Portuguese authorities, pressuring them to permit Gerry McCann to release a suspect description based on Jane Tanner's shaky sighting. That decision overrode police protocols, blurring the line between evidence and narrative. At the same time, Clarence Mitchell, once the director of media monitoring for Downing Street, was appointed as the McCanns' official spokesperson. His mission was not to investigate, but to manage. He became the face of a state-backed PR campaign designed to shield the family, manage the press, and shape public opinion. Through political weight, narrative control, and relentless media saturation, the United Kingdom built a fortress around the McCanns. Sympathy for them was carefully cultivated, doubt was aggressively deflected, and yet, behind this wall of protection, the one thing that mattered most, the truth, remained locked away, hidden inside records that Britain refused to share. In 2020, the story seemed to shift. German prosecutors announced a breakthrough, a new suspect, Christian Bruckner. He was a convicted offender, a drifter who had lived in the Algarve for years, moving in and out of the shadows of Praia da Luz. For the first time in over a decade, a sovereign state declared that this was not a disappearance, but a homicide. Madeleine, they said, was no longer alive. The world paused, holding its breath. But then, nothing. 4 years have passed since that dramatic announcement. No charges were filed. No courtroom ever heard the evidence. Bruckner sits in prison, yes, but for another crime. His connection to Madeleine remains at best speculative. When pressed, German prosecutors offered only a vague reply. There is currently no prospect of prosecution. Instead of indictments, Germany delivered theater. In 2023, they staged a highly publicized search near a reservoir, complete with dogs, drones, and forensic tents. Nothing was found. In 2024, another excavation in Atalaya drew headlines, cameras capturing every shovel in the dirt. Again, no evidence emerged. These operations raised a haunting question. Were they genuine efforts to uncover truth, or were they carefully staged performances to maintain the illusion of progress? Even more troubling was Germany's refusal to fully coordinate with Portuguese authorities, despite conducting searches on Portuguese soil. No joint task force, no shared forensic oversight, no transparent results. Germany had declared itself the lead investigator, but withheld the details that mattered most. In this triangle of nations, Germany's role became clear. They offered a suspect, but not justice. They gave the world spectacle, but not answers. And like Portugal and the United Kingdom before them, they added another layer of silence to a case already suffocated by politics, pride, and fear. In most missing child investigations, the discovery of biological evidence would be a turning point, a moment when the case pivots toward truth with urgency. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, even the most compelling forensic clues were cast aside. Early in the investigation, 2 highly trained British sniffer dogs were brought to Portugal. One was specialized in detecting human blood. The other was trained to sense the scent of human decomposition. Their reputations were global, their records nearly flawless. And when they were released into the world of Madeleine's disappearance, their alerts were chillingly specific. Both dogs independently signaled in only 2 places, inside apartment 5A, where Madeleine was last seen, and inside the Renault Scenic rental car that the McCanns had used weeks after her disappearance. Nowhere else. Not in the apartments of the friends, not in other vehicles, not at Robert Murat's property, a man then under heavy suspicion. Only at the McCanns' apartment and their car. In any other case, this would have been a breakthrough. A reason to re-examine the timeline, collect more forensic samples, and reassess every theory on the table. But that did not happen. Instead, the dog alerts became an inconvenience, an obstacle to the narrative of abduction. The McCanns themselves cast doubt on the dog's reliability. Kate McCann, in particular, made a statement that raised more questions than it answered. Could a dog really smell the scent of death 3 months later, after a body had been removed? For a mother who publicly insisted that her daughter had been abducted and was still alive, the phrasing was striking. She didn't just question the dogs, she imagined the removal of a body. To many, it sounded less like disbelief and more like a slip, a defensive picture of a scenario she had already considered. Even more disturbing than the reaction was the silence that followed. Neither British nor Portuguese authorities treated the alerts as central leads. No targeted searches were launched based solely on the dog's findings. The cadaver scent found in the car boot was never linked to a confirmed DNA profile. Instead of triggering deeper investigation, the results were quietly set aside. Years later, Dr. Mark Perlin, a world-renowned expert in complex DNA interpretation, offered to reanalyze the original data with advanced software capable of cracking cases long thought impossible. He even offered to do it free of charge. His work had solved cold cases across the world, but in Madeleine's case, his offer was ignored. Neither the family nor the German authorities responded. No cooperation, no explanation, just silence. Taken separately, one might dismiss these details. Dogs are not infallible. DNA can be complex. Words spoken in grief can be misread. But together, they form a chilling pattern. If evidence supported the abduction theory, it was embraced. If it challenged that theory, it was discredited, ignored, or buried. This is not the rhythm of a search for truth. It is the rhythm of a story being protected. In most criminal cases, witness memories shift with time. Details blur, contradictions emerge, and accounts evolve as the years pass. But in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, an eerie anomaly has endured. The 7 friends who dined with Kate and Jerry McCann on that night in May 2007, the group known as the Top of 7, have never altered their story. 17 years later, their core testimonies remain perfectly synchronized, untouched, and unchallenged. They all claim they shared dinner at the Tapas restaurant, took turns checking on their children, and noticed nothing unusual until Kate raised the alarm. No one has broken rank. No one has contradicted the group's version of events. On the surface, this might look like unity, but beneath it lies a troubling reality. Their consistency has never been tested. Portuguese police once proposed a reconstruction of the night, a step that should have been routine. Walking through the timeline, reenacting who went where, when, and what they saw. The Tapas 7 refused. They cited trauma, media intrusion, legal concerns. And no authority, neither in Portugal, nor in the UK, nor in Germany, ever compelled them to take part. From the very beginning, their voices were managed. David Payne, a central figure in the group, once told reporters, "This is our matter. All comments go through Jerry." The implication was stark. Not only would the McCanns speak for everyone, but any deviation from the script would be silenced from within. The group became untouchable, protected, shielded. 17 years have passed, and not one of them has been re-interviewed by German authorities, even as they declared themselves leaders of the investigation. Not one prosecutor has demanded a cross-examination. Not one judge has forced them under oath. The silence has been allowed to stand, as though silence itself was proof of innocence. But in truth, silence can be a shield. It can be the strongest defense of all. And so, the question remains, if there is nothing to hide, why has that silence lasted for so long? To understand how Portugal handled the Madeleine McCann investigation, one must first look at a case that came before it, the disappearance of 8-year-old Joana Cipriano in 2004. That tragedy unfolded in the Algarve, the very same region where Madeleine would vanish 3 years later. Joanna's mother and uncle eventually confessed to murdering her, but those confessions carried scars. The mother was photographed with visible bruises on her face, raising allegations that her statements had been extracted under duress. Soon, accusations surfaced that certain officers had coerced suspects, falsified documents, and crossed ethical lines. One officer was even convicted of fabricating records. Though the legal process ran its course, the damage was done. Portugal's justice system was left vulnerable, its credibility questioned. And when Madeleine disappeared in May 2007, that shadow returned. As investigators began to consider not only abduction, but also the possibility that Madeleine had died in the apartment and her body had been hidden, the international backlash was swift. Instead of engaging with evidence, the British press resurrected the Cipriano scandal, using it as a weapon to undermine Portuguese investigators. By October 2007, under the weight of media fire and diplomatic pressure, the leadership of the investigation was reshuffled. Critical leads, cadaver dog alerts, inconsistencies in the Friends timeline were minimized, and Portugal's autonomy was eroded. The state bent under international scrutiny, trading investigative integrity for political survival. In the years that followed, the battle for narrative control spilled into courtrooms. A former Portuguese investigator, removed from the case, published a book suggesting Madeleine had died in the apartment. The McCanns sued for defamation, winning an initial ban on the book. But in 2021, the European Court of Human Rights overturned that decision, ruling in favor of the investigator's right to freedom of expression. It was not an endorsement of his theory, but a reminder that within a justice system, voices cannot be silenced simply because they challenge a convenient narrative. The implications were stark. Portugal had stifled its own investigators, only for a supranational court to restore their right to speak. What should have been a sovereign investigation became a lesson in how external pressure can dismantle institutional independence. Once the credibility of Portuguese police was undermined, pursuing alternative theories became politically toxic. The result was paralysis, avenues of inquiry abandoned not for lack of evidence, but for lack of legitimacy. The intersection of the Cipriano and McCann cases is more than coincidence. It is a warning. When past mistakes are weaponized, they can cripple present investigations. When institutions bow to political optics, the truth becomes secondary. And for Portugal, the cost was not only reputational, but operational. Their justice system retreated, leaving Madeleine's case to be consumed by the louder voices of foreign powers. If Portugal's role was defined by mistakes, the United Kingdom's was defined by control. In the days following Madeleine's disappearance, a figure arrived in Praia da Luz, whose presence would change everything. Clarence Mitchell. At first, he was there as a government liaison, but quickly he transformed into something else entirely, the McCann's full-time spokesperson, the architect of their public image. Under Mitchell's direction, every interaction with the press was filtered. Every statement was polished, every appearance managed. The grieving parents became not just the center of a criminal investigation, but the face of a global media campaign. Interviews with the BBC, Sky News, CNN, nothing was left to chance. The family's image was shielded, their narrative curated with professional precision. What began as compassion for a missing child began to look more like an information control strategy. The influence reached far beyond the press. Then Prime Minister Gordon Brown personally intervened, pressuring Portuguese authorities to allow Jerry McCann to release a suspect sketch based on Jane Tanner's account. Her description was vague, her sighting uncorroborated, yet it became one of the earliest and most widely circulated depictions of a possible abductor. Law enforcement officials questioned why such a fragile detail was allowed to steer the case. The answer lay not in evidence, but in politics. Behind the scenes, the UK Home Office refused to share vital data with Portuguese investigators. The McCann's phone records, financial transactions, and medical files. These omissions crippled the ability to cross-check the timeline or test alternative theories. Requests were met with silence, just as the media storm grew louder. Within 72 hours, the disappearance of a 3-year-old child had transformed into a global event. Donations poured into the Find Madeleine Fund. Politicians, celebrities, and even religious leaders voiced support. The story was everywhere, but not by accident. It was orchestrated, a PR operation as polished as any political campaign. And with this machine in motion, the narrative solidified. Madeleine was abducted by a faceless intruder. Other possibilities, an accident, a cover-up, or involvement closer to home, were stigmatized, dismissed as attacks on grieving parents. Portuguese investigators who dared suggest otherwise were vilified. The UK's involvement was unprecedented. It was more than diplomatic support for citizens abroad. It was a deliberate shaping of perception, a way of steering not just the headlines, but the very direction of the investigation. And once that machinery began to turn, the truth, whatever it was buried beneath the weight of political power and media strategy. 17 years have passed since 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. 17 years of headlines, of suspects named and discarded, of public declarations and private refusals. And yet, the most striking fact remains. No one has ever been charged. Not a single individual has faced trial for her disappearance. Over the years, suspects have come and gone. Robert Murat, briefly under suspicion. Kate and Jerry McCann themselves declared arguidos in 2007 before the status was quietly lifted. And most recently, Christian Bruckner declared the prime suspect by German prosecutors in 2020. But each time, the system has found a way to step back, to hesitate, to stall. Suspects exist in name only, never in law. The same pattern repeats. Forensic leads left unexplored. Witness timelines never reconstructed. Requests for records blocked by the UK Home Office. Offers of DNA reanalysis ignored. the top of 7 allowed to maintain their perfect, unbroken silence. Across 3 countries, every opportunity to push harder has been softened, redirected, or buried. By 2022, Operation Grange in the UK had been reduced to little more than an administrative office. Portugal, though officially custodian of the case, was sidelined. And Germany, despite holding Bruckner's file, admitted bluntly that there was no prospect of prosecution. What began as an international search for a missing child has faded into bureaucratic theater, press releases, staged searches, and unanswered questions. It is tempting to call this a failure, to say that the investigation collapsed under the weight of mistakes and missteps. But what if it is something else? What if the absence of resolution is not an accident, but a choice? The pattern suggests not incompetence, but quiet agreement, an understanding that this case, too big and too dangerous, is better left unsolved. Madeleine McCann is more than a missing child. She is now a symbol of how politics, public relations, and institutional fear can bury the truth deeper than any grave. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is not that no one could answer the question of what happened to her, but that, after 17 years, the institutions involved never truly wanted to.